Hey everyone, it's Nick, and I'm back with another theory. Not because the last video actually got a lot of attention, or any at all. That's not why I'm doing this. I'm doing it because I'm a fan, and because I want to get these ideas out there and start a dialogue with other people. So there are a few theories which have been floating around my head since forever, like Skyward Sword being on its own timeline, Impa being an immortal, and the goddess Hylia and the goddess of time being one and the same. These are just three theories in particular, which were beginning to link up in my head as I played through several of my favourite Zelda games in the lead up to the release of Wii U, and it got me thinking. The trouble is, the more I analysed the potential for these theories, the more I got stuck, until I made a little bit of a breakthrough, and it comes down to the time travel mechanic in Skyward Sword. So I'd like to take a moment just to show you what I mean, and then we'll come back to these points I've made, and see if there can be some solid evidence to back them up. So, as you'll no doubt be familiar, the official timeline from Nintendo states that the chronology of the Zelda universe begins with the creation of Heaven and Earth, immediately followed by the events of Skyward Sword, and I am reading that verbatim. Next we get the Minish Cap, Four Swords, and Ocarina of Time, where the timeline then splits three ways. I've observed before how the three timelines also seem to represent the Triforce of Power, Wisdom, and Courage within the games that sit within the timelines. But what if Ocarina of Time was not the only example of a split timeline? It is not the only game to feature time travel. Skyward Sword also sees the use of time travel, once through timeshift stones, and again through a device called the Door of Time. The door is first used when the young Impa travels to the future to save Zelda from moblins in the Elden province. Now why is this an important point? How did she know to go there? Did the old Impa remember that she went to the future as a lass, and remembered the exact place she needed to send herself to defend the princess? If she knew all that, why could she not just send Link there instead? There are actually a lot of questions that this raises, and if I were to ask them all, I would just confuse myself and you, so let's get some more context. First, we have to understand time travel. I know, we can't because it doesn't exist, but popular culture has given us some set of rules for how this could work. So let's start with some of my favourites. The first type of time travel that we get is what I'm going to dub fulfillment paradox. It's a mechanic where the subject or the audience is aware that their presence in the past is fulfilling something that has already happened to them. To put this more plainly, it's like how John Connor sent Kyle Reese to the past to protect his mother. He knew Kyle Reese was his father, and that sending him back would create a paradox with his birth, because he wouldn't have existed to do that in the first place. Or if you would prefer, it's like when Harry decides to cast the Patronus charm to save himself and Sirius when they're beset by Dementors. He explains perfectly how he was able to do this, even though it was a skill that had eluded him for the entire book.
Right, Hermione. It wasn't my dad I saw earlier. It was me. I saw myself conjuring the Patronus before. I knew I could do it this time because, well, I'd already done it. Does that make sense? No!
Even Link, in Ocarina of Time, carries out the fulfillment paradox by learning the Song of Time in the future from the man in the windmill, who learned it from Link as a child. Therefore, going back in time fulfills that paradox, and Link knew exactly what would happen. The other type of time travel mechanic, which is commonly dubbed the butterfly effect, is that the smallest change can alter the course of history, but Doc Brown probably explains it better.
Here, let me illustrate. Imagine that this line represents time. Here's the present, 1985, the future, and the past. Prior to this point in time, somewhere in the past, the timeline skewed into this tangent, creating an alternate 1985. Alternate to you, me, and Einstein, but reality for everyone else. While we were in the future, Biff dropped the sports book, stole the time machine, went back in time, and gave the book to himself at some point in the past.
The whole thing is my fault. If I hadn't bought that damn book, none of this would have ever happened.
Well, that's all in the past.
You mean the future?
Whatever. It demonstrates precisely how time travel can be misused and why the time machine must be destroyed. After we straighten all of this out, our only chance to repair the present is in the past, at the point where the timeline skewed into this tangent.
So keep that in mind. What type of mechanic does Skyward Sword follow? Well, when Link first arrives in the sealed ground, inside the temple he can see an amber-coloured crystal behind the great doors, the same crystal that Zelda ends up in if you complete the first set of temples. So this is similar to the fulfillment paradox, in that she is already sealing in demise and it is her power which is failing. Even though when you first see the crystal, Zelda is in that moment at the same time as Link. It is inevitable that she will go back in time and seal herself in there. Fulfillment. Make sense?
No!
Despite this, we all know that the final outcome of the game is that Link frees Zelda and places the Master Sword into the pedestal in the past, and leaves it there, before returning to the future. If he did that, why didn't he see the Master Sword inside the door when he first came to the sealed grounds? Why didn't old Impa just say, "Oh, by the way, forget the sacred flames, the Master Sword is right there"?
Prior to this point in time, somewhere in the past, the timeline skewed into this tangent.
Thanks, Doc. It's because Link is the wild card. He is committing the butterfly effect, whereas Zelda is an agent of the goddess of Hylia and can only carry out the fulfillment paradox. She chooses Link as her hero so that he could do this. You may recall at the beginning of the video I boldly stated that Skyward Sword is on its own timeline. I believe that for the majority of the game, Skyward Sword is set in an era much later than any of the other games. The Golden Goddesses have been all but forgotten, and their power was entrusted to another entity who removed the Hylians from the violent surface and eventually reincarnated as one of them, forsaking her powers to enable her to create a hero. And that hero was able to gather up the Triforce and wish for the destruction of Demise, finally freeing this timeline of its evil once and for all. Oh, but then Girahim kidnapped Zelda and took her to the past, where Demise still existed. This is where the time travel mechanic switches from fulfillment to butterfly effect. Link follows her to the past, and we all know how that ends. But it is there in the past that Demise swears to reincarnate and return to them. It is also there, in the past, where Link leaves the Master Sword before returning to the future. Do you have any questions yet?
No!
Well, you should. Like, if Link destroys Demise in the past and then returns to the future, shouldn't the future be different as per Doc Brown's diagram? Yes, it should, but then again, the door of time was open the entire time. Unlike the DeLorean, it's keeping a continual connection to the time of Skyward Sword, so when they return to the future it is the same timeline that they were in, rather than opening a new bridge each time it's used, like the DeLorean does. You might also be asking, if that is true, how do you explain that the Master Sword was then present in the future, and the Goddess Bracelet, and the fact that Impa remembers what she said to Zelda in the past just before they travelled back to the future? Shouldn't all of those things have gone to a new timeline which the trio could not have returned to? Well, I did tell you I hit some snags in this theory, and this was a major one. If I was 100% sure of this, the old Impa would have had no recollection of the young Impa's actions, and the bracelet and the sword would have been lost in the new timeline. So let's backtrack a little bit. I thoroughly believe that it was either the goddess Hylia in the past, or old Impa in the future, who retrieved the young Impa from the past to protect Zelda. But not as a fulfillment paradox, but to create a butterfly effect. It was a desperate act to protect Zelda on her first descent to the surface, because this was the first time meeting her, and she doubted Link's skills at first. Now let's look at Impa herself. Isn't it strange that when we first meet her as an audience, she seems quite young? We do see her briefly as a kind nurse in the Minish Cap. By Ocarina of Time, she's beginning to show some grey, and in the Downfall timeline, she's an elderly lady. She doesn't exist in the adult or child timelines, which we will link back to, and in Skyward Sword we see her at her oldest, as well as at her youngest. Well, as I mentioned before, this is because I think that she actually is an immortal. Maybe. Not in the same sense as cannot be killed ever, like what Frieza was going for, but similar to Arwen from Lord of the Rings, in that she will age slowly but never die unless she allows it, like how Arwen forfeited her life for Aragorn. Aww.
Does that make sense?
No!
I know, it's commonly believed that the sages from Ocarina of Time were spirits who died in the respective temples that they were in, which might explain why Impa isn't in the adult timeline. But then again, this is all conjecture. What firm evidence is there? Well, when Zelda asks Impa to come back with her, the Sheikah replies that she is a being of this age and her place is there. Why would that matter so much if she was only jumping forwards, say, 50 years or so? And why would that concern her so much? Perhaps she was concerned of creating a paradox with the existence of her self from the past and her future self in one timeline. Perhaps because, with her connection to Hylia, she knew of her importance in the games to come, Ocarina of Time for instance, and so she must stay with the sword and wait for the hero of time. I will discuss how this knowledge could have been imparted to her and Hylia in just a moment. Impa has a close connection to Hylia. She is gifted a bracelet from Hylia's incarnation, and the Master Sword is also a tool of the goddess. So why have her memories, the sword, and the bracelet managed to transcend the established rules of time travel? Well, that is because Hylia is most likely the goddess of time. Maybe. I mean, is that so hard to believe? Let's take a look at the Lannaru province, the area where we first find the stones that enable Link to travel through time, as well as the Door of Time itself. This is an interesting mechanic in itself, as the timeline tells us that the events of Skyward Sword happen immediately after the creation of the world. Why are we then able to travel farther back in time in Skyward Sword, unless the game actually happened later on in the timeline? But back to my point. In later timelines, what do we find in the Lannaru province? A lake devoted to the goddess Hylia. That's pretty interesting. Let's look at some of the items that are associated with the goddess and her reincarnations. The Master Sword. In Ocarina of Time, it's a weapon of the goddess, and it is kept in the Temple of Time. And that is used to travel forward and back through time, similar to the Time Shift Stones. Zelda and her family are the keepers of the Ocarina of Time. Hyrule Historia teasingly states that the ocarina has the same color as the Time Shift Stones, and could they be made of the same material? But that isn't the only interesting device kept by the royal family. There is also the Pirate's Charm in Wind Waker, which allows sound to travel through time and space to whoever is holding it. One of the only other times that we've seen a player be able to communicate with Zelda remotely like this is when you first pick up the Ocarina of Time in the namesake title, where Zelda teaches you what else but the Song of Time. We only ever see Tetra and the King of Red Lions, both members of the Hylian bloodline, talking through the Pirate Charm. So again, a link to the goddess Hylia through the bloodline. The charm itself looks very similar to the Time Shift Stones. Tetra is an interesting side note while we're at it. After the Ocarina of Time was launched, the fourth triangle on the Hylian shield sprouted speculation about a fourth piece to the Golden Goddess's artifact, making it effectively a tetra force. Tetra is a type of adaptable fish, but it's also a root Greek word for the number 4. And as we know, the number 4 in Zelda lore has proven to be significant in almost every installment of the game. 4 elements, the 4 sword, 4 areas of Termina, 4 temples, and 4 giants, 4 sea charts in the Phantom Hourglass, and 4 Spirit Track glyphs in Spirit Tracks, 4 specimens of Master Ore, 4 provinces and light spirits in the Twilight Princess, 4 Silent Realm trials. The list goes on. The Tetra Force is also supported by my theory, in a way. You see, if Zelda/Hylia is the goddess of time, then the paradox presented by the bracelet and the Master Sword is able to be explained. She is the goddess of time, so she can create paradox. When Link placed the sword in the stone at the end of Skyward Sword, he creates an alternative timeline. Hylia's temple is then restructured as the Temple of Time for the Hero of Time to find the Master Sword and prevent the land of Hyrule from being corrupted as it was in Skyward Sword's separate timeline. Demise was destroyed and reincarnated for the first time as Ganondorf, which sprouts off a different set of events culminating in the downfall, child, and adult timelines. And above all, the Goddess of Time, while removed from the Triforce, is observed in the design of the Hylian shield, as she may not yet be reincarnated as Zelda in this timeline. Does that make sense?
No!
Each of the 4 goddesses of the Tetraforce then has their own separate timelines. Because the sword and the bracelet are artifacts of the goddess who controls time, they are exempt from the rules that we've previously established, and they allowed Impa, an acolyte of the goddess of time, to retain her memories across timelines. Zelda herself, an incarnation of Hylia, has proven to have intuitive knowledge about time travel as well, and at the end of Ocarina of Time she advises Link to return the sword to the pedestal, and that this will close the bridge between times. She knew that she was creating a new timeline just by making him put the sword back, that could not be crossed again. So where does this leave us? Well, this is just a theory, folks. However, it gives grounds for the timeline placement theory I've presented on Reddit, which you can find in the link beneath this video, or for a whole new timeline, unrestricted by the past and future events that we've seen so far, for the Zelda Wii U title to take place in. I posted this very undeveloped theory on Reddit last night in preparation for this video. I was just reaching out to the community to see what other input I could have, and actually got a few negative comments, so I really do hope that this has clarified my point of view on the matter. I am keen to know what you guys think now, seeing all the evidence that I've found. If you have any comments, please leave them below. Check out my other fan theory on my channel, and thanks very much for watching.
Mysterious thing, time. Powerful, and when meddled with,